MARe Museum of Recent Art from Bucharest was founded in 2018. In October 2018 we opened the museum, but the foundation MARe Museum of Recent Art was active on the Romanian art scene since 2014. We did exhibitions in many museums in Bucharest and across the country. That means in Buchantal Museum in Sibiu, in Museum of Art in Constanța, Museum of Art in Craiova, in Timișoara, Oradea, and in many other places. So MARe is a museum having a huge collection of more than 1,000 pieces. And now we're exhibiting in the permanent museum in the permanent collection of the museum almost 120 pieces. But we are always making exhibitions, temporary exhibitions, dedicated to younger Romanian artists on a collective framework and on hard, actual themes in Romanian civilization. So some of them were dedicated to issues like the sport, reflected in Romanian art since the 20th century until today. Some of them are dedicated, like the current exhibition, to the city and the development of the city, or to the image of the perfect woman figure in Romanian art, and so on. But parallel with this collective Romanian exhibitions dedicated to younger Romanian artists, we started from the very beginning with solo shows with prominent international artists. But the major artists and the major names could somehow obliterate the fact that we are focusing not on names, it's not name dropping, but on those artists who changed the way art today is made, exhibited and understood. This is why we started with a solo exhibition Man by Jeff Wall, and we followed with Martin Creed, with Gregor Schneider, Masha Hafif, and Vali Export, and Herman Nitsch, Tino Segal, and many other artists until today. The permanent collection of MARe Museum of Recent Art is on two of the floors of the museum, and that means the floor number 2 and the floor number 1. The museum has 5 levels actually, and in between the levels there are interlevels. But being at the second floor of the museum, we can start with the beginning. The beginning is 1965, the moment when the Romanian art is confronted with a political choice. The political choice was the change from the first step of the communist era in Romania to the second step. That means with the arrival of Nicolae Ceausescu in 1965, the references to socialist realism were totally obliterated. Instead that, in July 1965, during the report he was giving to the Congress of the Communist Party, he was insisting on the stylistic diversity instead of socialist realism. And the stylistic diversity was somehow preserving the ideological points, that means the propaganda points of the regime, but with many other means of expression than the usual realistic one of the Soviet era. And at that moment it was not freedom, but it was a kind of outsourcing for the artists. And this is why many Occidental, many Western idioms were imported and assimilated on the Romanian art scene. But there were some idioms which were local and at the same time international. This is why our collection starts with Ion Țuculescu, who was at that moment really propelled, although it was an amateur artist, that means with non-formal, being taught in a non-formal way. He was actually a doctor in medicine and biology, but practicing strongly art since the 1930s. And he was never exhibiting, never showing during the communist era in official exhibitions, but always practiced only his own neo-expressionist, totemic kind of art. He was very influential, and our exhibition in the permanent collection shows its impact on very different artists, from Andrei Cădere to Doru Bucur, Horia Berna, Paul Gerasim, Aurel Cojan, and many other artists who really embraced this totemic rendering of a very powerful expression. On the other side, there was at the same time during the mid-60s an opening towards the other kind of neo-modernity. That means the constructivist one. And this is why the movement Sigma from Timișoara was highly appreciated, including somehow by the regime. And they were allowed to develop an experimental pedagogical system. And people like Roman Cotoșman and Bertalan and Flondor were the pillars of this expression, which was somehow in a real polarity with the expressionist, abstract expressionist one developed in Bucharest. MARe is also making a step forward to the contemporary Romanian art. In the permanent collection of MARe at the first floor, you can find many works related to the 90s and 2000s. Artists were very active, including artists, women artists like Ecaterina Vrana and Vioara Bara and Ioana Bătrânu, who were exploring a very powerful, expressive, intimate, authoritarian somehow expression of force and vulnerability at the same time. And with such artists, MARe is articulating a discourse which is coming from a kind of trauma until today, a trauma related to the communist era in the 80s until today. There was a very powerful trauma quite recently, that means 1.5 years after the opening of MARe, which is the shared trauma, internationally shared trauma of the coronavirus. And this was affecting very strong MARe, because we've been closed for 2 months, and during that time it was absolutely amazing that we developed a lot of programs, most of them online, but some of them inside the museum, that we had the opportunity, being a closed space, but at the same time completely managed from the point of view of climatization, and that means far away from the virus. Everything was purified in real time, and we could afford to have a residency offered to a contemporary Romanian artist who was working somehow in the museum, Dumitru Gorzo, who was for a week really taking the museum on his own. And by the end of the quarantine period, we also had a residency given to Cosmin Manolescu, the performing artist, who was really developing a program, a full program of performances in the museum, and he was able to be seen by the public while being inside the museum, somehow captive, but was totally transparent, because it was very well helped by the architectural very specific way of MARe addressing the public, not only with its huge building of black stone, which is very closed in itself, like a black box. I mean, I know the black box in an airplane is generally orange, but our black box at MARe is like a bunker. It's very dark and it has no opening, it has no windows. It's like a monument of the black box of communism, which is really placed like a dense, oppressive presence on the contemporary times, which is a totally open, glass, purely transparent ground floor. And on that ground floor, the performing artists inside the museum were seen by the people outside. It was a very powerful, extremely human way of relating with not only the public, but with the bystanders during that heavy times of coronavirus.